Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to insert proactive lifelines. This is a technique of protecting your work, especially when you are knitting complicated patterns like lace patterns or brioche knitting. By inserting a proactive lifeline, you allow yourself to then have a way of catching all your stitches should you need to rip out some of your work. So if you have knit a certain part of your work and you know you haven't made any mistakes, so for instance here I have this horseshoe lace pattern that I've worked in the swatch and I've done about 4 repeats, and I think this would be a good point for me to insert a lifeline. Then you can do that. And let's say you keep knitting and you make a mistake in the next repeat or somewhere down the line, then if you have a lifeline, you can just take your stitches off the needle, take all of them off or rip all of them off, what's called frogging. You just go rip it, rip it, rip it, and take all the stitches off, and be certain that your stitches are going to get caught in the lifeline. So that's, it's a great way of sort of ensuring your work. So let me show you how that's done. Now you will need a darning needle or a tapestry needle and some type of scrap yarn that's skinnier or thinner than your working yarn. You can also use embroidery floss, or you could use dental floss and your knitting will smell minty fresh as you knit it. But anyway, just a scrap yarn, preferably of a contrasting color so it stands out as a lifeline. And I'm going to go ahead and thread this in. And you want to make sure that it's definitely longer than your entire piece. I've actually cut the piece here, but you can leave it attached to your scrap yarn, finish putting the lifeline, and then cut it. And the place to insert your lifeline is up to you. You can insert it after a certain number of repeats. You can certainly insert it after every repeat, but yes, it takes time, a little bit of time to put in that lifeline. So you might want to be the judge of where you want to insert your lifeline. So in this case, I've done 4 repeats. I'm going to insert it here. And all you're doing is you're taking your needle and you're just passing them through the stitches. So you can do a couple stitches at a time, maybe 2 or 3 stitches at a time. And this may work better if your knitting needle is a circular knitting needle, because then you could move your stitches to the thinner part of the circular needle, so it'll give you a little bit more space between the needle itself and the stitch. But I think it works fine with a regular needle as well, as long as you're using skinnier yarn than your working yarn. And so that's all you're doing, is inserting it through these stitches. 2 things to watch for when you're inserting. Make sure you are actually inserting it into the stitch and not catching the stitch below or splitting the stitch. So not doing this, but actually inserting it into the whole stitch. Okay, and then take the needle off and you've got your lifeline, and you can just leave it there and continue knitting as you would with your pattern. So in this case, if I want to continue knitting, I would just go ahead and insert my needle and start knitting. One thing to watch for when you're knitting in this next row, the very next row, is that you're actually inserting it right into the stitch and not accidentally catching that that lifeline. And so that's why it helps to have a contrasting color so you can clearly see it. And just be careful for this one stitch when you're knitting it that you're not catching the lifeline. Okay, now let me show you what happens when you have to actually rip out your stitches. So here I have a sample of a 1-stitch brioche knit in the flat, and this is a great stitch. I think if you're doing brioche, any kind of brioche pattern, it helps to have a proactive lifeline, because if you were to rip brioche stitches and try to pick them up with the needle, it can be a bit challenging. So to do that, I've inserted a lifeline here and I've knit about 6 rows, and let's say I made a mistake, I missed a yarn over, or I dropped a stitch accidentally. Oh no, I gotta take my stitches off. Having a lifeline gives me the confidence to just do this and rip, rip, rip all my stitches or all my rows. And I know it feels bad, 6 rows of brioche, but you're better off ripping 6 rows of brioche than ripping the whole thing and having to start all over. So here we go. I've ripped it all the way to the point where I have my lifeline. At this point, I'm just gonna take my needle and insert it into my stitch and pick up the stitch. And you just want to be sure that you're picking up all the stitches, which in the case of brioche, there's that complicated brioche stitch, those two stitches together. So you just want to make sure that you're picking up all the stitches. And with brioche, it can still be a bit challenging with the lifeline, but much less so if you didn't have the lifeline. And if it's a regular stitch, then it's just easy. You're just picking up all the stitches easily, no problem. So you'll just pick up all the stitches, and then you can either decide to pull the lifeline out, or you can leave it in and continue knitting. So I hope you give proactive lifelines a try on your next complicated knitting project, or even on a simple knitting project. Having a lifeline is just good insurance. Thanks for watching, and best wishes.